Hello everyone and welcome to today's session on Australia's strengths in the global biopharmaceutical industry. This webinar is hosted by Informa Pharma Intelligence. We offer a number of leading products to support clinical, commercial and regulatory decision making in the biopharmaceutical industry. Please do get in touch with us if you'd like to find out any more about any of these during the presentation. We're going to be leading a lot of these products during the content, and this includes Biomed Tracker for extensive deal-making activity and Trial Trove for clinical trial intelligence. Before we start, please let me introduce my co-presenter, Amanda Miklas. Amanda is part of Informa Pharma Intelligence's consulting team, our custom research practice, and has spoken at several leading industry events on the topic of deal-making and cell and gene therapy. My name is Daniel Chancellor. I'm a principal analyst within our thought leadership team. I have a decade of experience working across the various pharma intelligence products that you may subscribe to, such as Sightline, Biomed Tracker, and Data Monitor Healthcare. Here's an agenda for the webinar, so you know what to expect. So after some introductions and briefly setting the scene, Amanda is going to take you through the latest fundraising and partnership trends in Australia using proprietary data from MedTrack and strategic transactions. I will then share the trial activity that's taking place in Australia, in particular focusing on the early stage research and the prominent industry sponsors, drugs and therapy areas. We will then reflect on how Australia is positioned to capitalise on the broader industry trends before concluding and taking a question and answer session. You'll be able to submit questions at any time through the webinar, and we'll do our best to address as many of these as possible at the end of the hour. Please note that the webinar is being recorded, and you will have access to both the slides and the full recording once we are finished. Okay, so let's get started. There are various statistics that you can use to describe the Australian biopharma industry. IQVIA will tell you that it's the 14th largest prescription drug market, worth around $13 billion US, growing relatively modestly at 4%, although this is expected to slow down in the future. The market is predominantly led by multinational companies, which are attracted to Australia by its population, workforce, certainly access to medicines, and a pro-business governance. Now, the trade body AusBiotech will tell you that Australia belongs in the world's top 5 for biotech. I'll describe a bit more about this on the next slide. There are 140 life sciences companies listed on the Australian Securities Exchange, with a combined market cap exceeding 50 billion Australian dollars in 2017. The vast majority of this is made up by the company CSL, which comfortably is placed within the top 20 globally in biopharma. Importantly, Australia has a life sciences workforce of around 230,000 employees, the majority of which are in industry or R&D roles within biopharma. I'd now like to start comparing Australia to some of its peers and asking the question about whether it's punching above its weight or not. So let's look a bit closer at this top 5 biotech position. This ranking is from the latest iteration of the Scientific American Worldview scores. And Australia sits among other technology research-based economies, including Singapore, Denmark, and near neighbours New Zealand. Australia outscores traditional established pharma markets due to the productivity of its domestic biotech scene. And it also gains high marks for the quality of its workforce and government policy. This certainly paints an intriguing picture and was one of the prompts for us to delve into other data sets to see how Australia performs on other metrics too. So simply based on the size of its population, the prescription drug market in Australia is certainly robust and comparable to its peers, such as South Korea, Spain, Canada, and the Netherlands. Patients have excellent access to new medicines via the Pharmaceutical Benefit Scheme. However, access to capital and fundraising by Australian companies can only really be described as modest. both financing and partnership totals trail those that are achieved by Canadian, South Korean, and Dutch companies. Australia does have robust clinical trial activity, despite its relative geographic isolation. It has the infrastructure and expertise that is able to attract multinational companies to perform trials at all stages of clinical development. Now, I also want to talk about the role of the Australian government in supporting the biopharma industry, because it's certainly investing heavily, both directly via research funding and indirectly to incentivize businesses. The federal government already invests around $850 million annually in health research via the National Health and Medical Research Council. Separately, the government established the Medical Research Future Fund in 2015, which is a separate $20 billion pot of money. This is on track to reach full capitalization by 2021, supported by a considerable government injection this July. This fund has already enabled the creation of 8 large-scale public health missions since 2017, and these span a wide range of healthcare challenges. Once the fund is fully operational, it should support an additional $650 million annually in investment in the life sciences. Now, although this next fund I'd like to describe as smaller, the government has also set up an additional $500 million biomedical research fund. This provides companies with venture capital, and this will enable them to develop and commercialize biomedical discoveries in Australia, boosting the domestic industry. There is the stipulation that these discoveries and the investment stays within Australia. The total picture of all of this investment is that the Australian government is considerably directly investing in public and private research. The government is also supportive of industry via a generous and competitive R&D tax incentive scheme. This provides companies with a refundable tax credit in the region of 38.5 to 43.5% for research conducted in Australia. This is one of the reasons why like-for-like clinical research can be notably cheaper in Australia than many other developed countries. So Australia certainly has lots going on in its favour as a place for the biopharma industry to do their business. This explains its competitiveness with numerous initiatives to make sure that it remains so in the future. With this context established, I'd now like to introduce Amanda to talk about fundraising and partnership trends within Australia.
Thanks, Dan. In the next section, we'll focus on trends in deal-making across Australia for the last several years, specifically looking at financing of companies and partnership trends. And we'll start first with financing. The figure on the right-hand side of the slide shows the volume and the US dollar value of Australian pharmaceutical and biotech company financings from 2015 through about the late third quarter of 2019. The financing dollar volume on this figure is split between public offerings and private placements. In all, over this 5-year time period, Australian pharma and biotech companies raised a total of $2.1 billion US dollars, which translates on average to about 40 deals per year, together representing an average annual fundraise of $400 million US dollars. You'll notice in 2015 there was quite a spike in the dollar volume, and this was due to an outlier, which was a $512 million private placement done by CSL, which is a leading biotech company in Australia that focuses on rare diseases and vaccines research. Overall, there is a higher volume of private placements and a higher dollar value attributed to those private placements than public offerings. And this could be for many reasons that companies tend to turn to private investors and not just a trend that's isolated in Australia, but more of a global trend. As opposed to public offerings, private placements have less stringent regulatory requirements and offer a much faster route to raising funds, all the while avoiding the volatility and the uncertainty of public markets. Australian company financing in aggregate is generally smaller compared with Western markets, but very much in line with many of the countries in its peer set, such as the Netherlands and South Korea. At this point in the year, it's still a little too early to tell if 2019 will continue the trend of flat growth that we have seen in the number of financings done. Now moving on to the most active companies in terms of the volume of financings done over the past 5 years, you'll notice there's quite a strong representation from companies working in both the oncology area as well as regenerative medicine. On the regenerative medicine side, Mesoblast, which has developed a platform of mesenchymal lineage adult stem cells, over this 5-year time frame raised the most money of any company, coming in at just over $250 million US. Notably, Mesoblast did a US IPO of its shares on NASDAQ in 2015. The company also received an investment from top-tier US biotech Celgene, which is now becoming part of Bristol Myers Squibb, that at the time also gave Celgene a 6-month right of first refusal on cell therapies in development for a range of diseases, including graft versus host, cancer, irritable bowel syndrome, and organ transplant rejection. Benetech Biopharma was also a strong fundraiser in the regenerative medicine group and brought in nearly $13 million. And Benetech is developing an RNA interference technology using gene therapy expression tools called DNA-directed RNAi approach. On the oncology side, there were several active fundraisers, including immuno-oncology company Immutep, which brought in $38 million, ProPanc Biopharma, which is developing a pancreatic proenzyme formulation to prevent tumor recurrence and metastasis, and that company raised $19 million. And Prescient Therapeutics, which has a pipeline of targeted therapies led by an AKT inhibitor in development for breast and ovarian cancer, and Prescient raised $11 million. With the exception of Mesoblast, many of the transaction values on the individual financings were actually quite small, in the under $10 million range, and multiple companies did multiple rounds of financing. For example, ProPanc Biopharma, one of the oncology companies that I just mentioned, completed 20 financings over this 5-year time period. If we look at the companies that have done the largest single financings between 2015 and 2019, all but one of these have been private placements, and this is not surprising given the overall trend that we saw with Australian company financing in general. The single highest financing done during the time period was CSL's $512.4 million private placement that I mentioned a couple of slides ago, which the company did in 2015 to help pay down debt. Both Mesoblast and Mayne Pharma have also raised significant single financing amounts. For Mesoblast, this included the IPO that I just discussed in the last slide, a U.S. initial public offering done in 2015 that raised close to $56 million. And Mesoblast subsequently went on to secure a $75 million credit facility. Mayne Pharma also did 2 big financings, and they were both done concurrently with the acquisition of generic pain medicines from Forest Laboratories and Actavis, which have now been merged into Allergan. Now that we've finished looking in detail at Australian company financings, let's move on to top-level partnership trends. The figure on the right-hand side of the slide shows the volume and the US dollar value of partnerships involving Australian companies over the same time period from 2015 to the present. The value on this figure includes not only the upfront payment on deals, but also any potential milestones such as development, regulatory, and sales milestones that may get paid out. There's been quite a fluctuation in the deal value year over year, and possibly a downward trend in the number of deals, with a slow start in 2019, although again the year isn't over yet. Similar to what we saw with financings, partnership dollars in Australia are quite small compared with its peers, with the exception of Spain. But the volume of deals is in line with the activity of others in the peer set. On average, there have been about 60 partnerships signed per year at an average annual value of $1.2 billion. And when we look at the phase at the time of deal signing, there are two different ends of the drug development spectrum represented, where we see a high volume of deals signed at the early stage, so at the preclinical stage, but also a high volume of deals done for approved products or marketed products. So on one hand, you have in-licensors that are willing to take a certain degree of risk and in-license those early stage assets, or in partner for a platform technology that has the capability to generate multiple drug candidates. But on the other end, in-licensing of a marketed or approved product may be perceived as the ultimate validated asset in a deal due to the fact that those products have gained regulatory approval. We can take a closer look at deal activity by the therapy area of the product's license to get an idea for where Australian research is being focused. Unsurprisingly, oncology is the leading therapy area on deals over this 5-year time frame and represented about a quarter of the deal volume. And oncology deals have been increasing year over year. Behind oncology, the next leading therapy areas on deal making were CNS diseases and infectious diseases. Among the CNS disease deals, licensing agreements for pain management products were quite prominent and represented a wide range of product types, including small molecules such as opioids, as well as advanced therapies. And among infectious disease deals, most of these were for marketed products, and in particular, Amuron signed a number of distribution deals for its Travelon Traveler's Diarrhea product. This table here shows the highest value deals involving Australian companies between 2015 and 2019. And the top 10 group of deals here is really dominated by agreements focused on CNS diseases as well as oncology, but at the same time includes quite a diverse mix of products, ranging from small molecules to marketed generics to advanced therapies such as cell and gene therapies. The flow of the licensing typically moves from an Australian biopharma company partnering out its products with a multinational company such as a big pharma company. Deal values are generally on the lower side. Over the 5-year time period that we looked at, there was only $1 billion deal that was signed, and that was actually just happened about a month ago between Mesoblast and a German company called Grunenthal for an allogeneic cell therapy in chronic low back pain, and that deal was worth $1.1 billion US. Upfront payments are also generally on the lower side and ranged in the $10 to $30 million region. But this is not very surprising and is sort of what we see in overall deal-making trends, in that the largest proportion of the disclosed deal value is attributed to back-end loaded milestone payments, such as development or sales milestone payments that may or may not ever get paid out, whereas just a small proportion of that disclosed deal value is assured money that's paid up front. In taking a little bit deeper look at the companies involved on deal making, the figure on the left-hand side of the slide shows the most active Australian biopharma companies by the number of deals signed. Emerge Health and Main Pharma were the most active in-licensors, so these are the most active companies in terms of partnering out their products with either fellow Australian companies or multinational companies, whereas the other firms that are listed on this figure are more active in terms of out-licensing. If we look at the flip side and look at the multinational companies which have been most actively partnering with Australian-based companies, the figure on the bottom right of the screen shows those most active big pharma companies, led by Merck & Co. and AstraZeneca, which have each signed 5 deals. For example, Bionomics has teamed up, Merck & Co. has teamed up multiple times with Bionomics in the areas of oncology and neuropathic pain, while AstraZeneca has done multiple deals with Star Pharma around Star Pharma's DEP drug delivery technology. I'm going to turn it over to Dan now, who is going to walk us through in more detail the R&D activity in the Australian market.
Great, thank you very much, Amanda. So what I'm going to show you next is some analysis of industry-sponsored trials conducted at sites within Australia over the past decade. The source for this information is Pharma Intelligence's Trial Trove product, which is the gold standard database for clinical trial intelligence. So we're going to start with the most top-line trends. At this most top-line level, you can see that industry is sponsoring more trials in Australia than ever before. As of our data cutoff, there were approximately 4,200 active, planned, or completed clinical trials within Australia over the course of this decade. This is 7.3% of the global total trials. That is to say that 7.3% of all global studies include investigational sites within Australia. Last year was a record total for clinical trials, as 511 studies were initiated, and the overall growth of the decades is 4.1% compound annual growth. This Australian growth contrasts to a more modest 2.5% growth globally, although you'll note by the grey shading in this figure that the trial growth globally has exceeded this in the last 5 years. It seems to have kicked up a bit. So of all of these studies in Australia, so around 4,200 in our data sets, a large majority also include investigational sites outside of Australia. This shows the decentralization of clinical research, especially at later stages of drug development, as biopharma companies seek to design studies that have as broad a reach as possible. The ideal trial would meet the requirements for a wide range of different regulatory bodies. This is an important point to consider and certainly will feature in the subsequent slides. So let's now take a look at the distribution of these trials across various different cuts. And we're going to start first by looking at the phase of development. In researching this presentation, I certainly read a lot about how Australian CROs suggest that multinational companies should be looking to conduct their phase 1 research in Australia, owing to the potential time and cost savings. With the clinical trial notification scheme, a company can get approval for a trial in as little as 6 weeks, This contrasts the IND process in the US potentially taking up to a year. Now, this message does indeed appear to be fueling the growth in early stage research. Around half of the absolute growth in new trial starts is driven by phase 1 or phase 1/2 trials. These now equate to around 30% of current trials in Australia. If we rank Australia against its peers on the absolute number of these early stage trials, the country rises as high as 7th globally. While if you expand this to include all clinical stages, Australia only ranks 12th. There is certainly a very strong and competitive environment for early phase clinical research in Australia. Now, one thing I thought that was evident from the previous slides is that the proportion of late stage trials is actually still quite large. So we're now going to talk a bit more about late stage trials. Now, naturally, logic would tell you that there should be many more early stage trials than later, as dictated by attrition, or the attrition that you see at later stages in the drug pipeline. Globally, this is certainly the case. As you can see on the right-hand side of the graph shown, we track twice as many early stage trials in the pink color as mid-stage or late-stage trials, with even fewer post-marketing studies. Now, focusing on the Australia bar, there's a very strong emphasis towards later stage registrational trials, as denoted by the pink area. So the majority of trial activity in Australia is in support of global regulatory filings, and that trial trends are therefore dictated by the global market. This links back to the facts that I mentioned earlier, with 80% of trials in Australia also including investigational sites outside of the country. I'd now like to switch to looking at which companies are sponsoring these trials in Australia. The answer is overwhelmingly that multinational companies are conducting the vast majority of clinical research, with very few domestic leaders. The Melbourne headquartered company CSL is by far and away the leading Australian company, although it ranks a lowly 35th, with just 23 trials over the last decade in our dataset. In fact, the list of leading companies is very much what you'd expect if you were looking at global trial trends. Novartis is top of the pile, ahead of Roche, Merck, GSK, Bristol Myers Squibb, and Pfizer. Not shown on the graph, but also notable among the list, includes publicly funded bodies such as the National Health and Medical Research Council and Australasian Leukemia and Lymphoma Group. These bodies often co-sponsor a trial in conjunction with an industry partner. Let's now look at the therapeutic areas first, and we'll also look at the diseases and drugs within this set of trial. So starting at the therapeutic area level, the outlook in Australia very closely mirrors the global trends. And this is depicted in the two pie charts. Oncology, of course, always has the largest slice, 35% of trials in the case of Australia. This exceeds the global total, where 27% of trials involve cancer patients. In fact, all of the top 6 therapeutic areas are consistent across the Australian and global datasets. So this is oncology in first, immunology and inflammation, central nervous system research, endocrine and metabolic diseases, infectious diseases, and lastly, cardiovascular medicine. Australia is often mentioned as an ideal place to perform flu and allergy research, as its seasons run counter to the main markets in the Northern Hemisphere. So in theory, development programs can run year-round. This isn't necessarily apparent in our trial trove dataset. Vaccines research is another area in which Australia is lower than the global averages. Following on from this large emphasis on the oncology therapy area, 7 out of the top 10 most studied diseases are also oncology indications. As you can see in the chart, non-small cell lung cancer leads by a large margin with 277 trials over the past decade in our dataset. This is ahead of some of the other more prevalent solid tumor types, such as breast, melanoma, colorectal cancer, and renal cancer. The unspecified solid tumour grouping refers to trials in which maybe multiple tumour types were evaluated, or if the tumours themselves are not classified by location, but rather a molecular signature. Non-Hodgkin's lymphoma is another cancer indication that's highly studied in Australia and is the most prevalent blood cancer. So on this indication level, Australia does begin to show some notable differences from the global data set. If you look globally, respiratory infections is the second most commonly studied disease group, although it only just registers within Australia's top 10 in 8th place. Again, diabetes is a hugely studied indication with over 3,000 clinical trials globally, which places it in 3rd position. Although these trials are far less emphasized in Australia, where diabetes is just in 7th. So the common theme is that respiratory infections and diabetes, these are both large primary care indications. Clinical trials of such diseases are moving into more populous countries. Australia's place is more for specialty diseases, often when the treatments themselves are high cost and access to these is not universal. So to emphasize this point about high-cost medicines in Australia, I'm now going to show the top 10 most studied drugs. Again, as you'd expect from the previous 2 slides, oncology is dominant, accounting for 8 out of the top 10. Pointing towards the recent trend towards immuno-oncology, which arms the immune system to tackle cancer, the top 4 drugs are all PD-1 checkpoint inhibitors, with ipilimumab and avelumab also appearing further down the list. The other oncology drugs in this list are the targeted lymphoma drugs, venetoclax and ibrutinib. So the 2 non-oncology drugs are color-coded differently. I won't go into detail for the natural product entry. This is a bit of a catch-all term within TrialTrove. But elovocumab is worth mentioning as a novel PCSK9 inhibitor and is primarily studied for the treatment of dyslipidemia. So in total, this entire list all gained their first approval this decade. And mirroring the broader industry trends, there's a huge shift away from primary care indications and instead towards specialty diseases with high-cost biologic drugs. Now, some of the ultimate high-cost drugs are cell and gene therapies. These are tailored either to the individual patient or to the particular genetic cause of disease. I wanted to explore how exposed Australia is to trials of such agents. So as you can see in the graph by the increasing pink bars, Australia is conducting more cell and gene therapy trials than ever before. 17 studies so far this year is a particular highlight, and it mirrors the global backdrop in grey of increasing cell and gene therapy trials too. However, Australia's own growth in advanced therapy trials is lagging behind the global numbers. We've calculated just a 10% compound annual growth rate through this decade, contrasting 15% globally. In particular, in the second part of this decade, the number of new cell and gene therapy trials has doubled globally as the technologies are really taking off, while it's still somewhat flat in Australia. Some of the leading sponsors of cell and gene therapy trials in Australia include industry giants such as Amgen and Novartis, in addition to domestic companies such as Magellan Stem Cells and Mesoblast. If you look at which indications are being evaluated, the 2 most common settings are osteoarthritis and pain, which is certainly an application of stem cell research. But I think the fact that it's these diseases rather than niche genetic diseases or oncology settings is curious, and it speaks to some of Australia's shortcomings that I'm going to go into on the next slide. So Australia is lagging behind some of its peer group in terms of the number of cell and gene therapy trials. This graph shows the top 10 countries in pink, with Australia narrowly in 11th position. Part of the reason why Australia lags somewhat is this complexity of manufacture for such therapies. Demand among biopharma companies for investigational material for these trials outstrips current manufacturing capacity. And Australia's geographic isolation means that realistically it needs to be self-sufficient in order to ensure adequate supply. This is true globally, but certainly for Australia, an investment in manufacturing facilities and expertise is needed. Another factor limiting clinical trials for cell therapies is the fact that loopholes have existed by which patients can gain access to unproven but potentially regenerative medicines directly through clinicians and outside of the clinical trial setting. This is where companies such as Magellan Stem Cells have operated. The Australian regulator, the TGA, has also been criticised for a lack of experience with advanced therapies when compared to other regulatory bodies such as the US FDA. With this, I'm going to hand back over to Amanda so she can talk a bit more about the global context for cell and gene therapies, an area that she's been tracking for several years.
Thanks, Dan. As Dan just mentioned, we'd like to tie all of this together and put the Australian-focused trends that we've just gone through into perspective of certain key global trends. First, beginning with cell and gene therapy, regenerative medicine overall, which is a relatively new market in terms of the latest generation of CAR T therapies and directly administered gene therapies that have been approved in the last few years. There is potential for Australian companies to break into this market, particularly via a deal with a company that's more established, possibly, and located in the western part of the world. But there are barriers to entry that we'll talk about in a moment. As we just heard from Dan, clinical trial activity for Australian companies in cell and gene therapy has been slower moving than the broader field of players. And we can take a look at the overall pipeline now. There's been significant growth in the cell and gene therapy pipeline over the past 20 plus years. And in particular, in the last 10 years, so going back to 2010, the volume of therapies in development has increased by 24%, with a strong preclinical pipeline that's supporting early-stage discoveries. In 2019, for the first time, the volume of cell and gene therapies in the pipeline surpassed the 1,000 mark, so it was quite a milestone. And I think a question that may be on a lot of people's minds is whether or not the recent deal that Mesoblast did with Grunenthal for its allogeneic cell therapy in chronic low back pain is going to be a bellwether in terms of Australian companies really expanding in regenerative medicine, and a strategy that Australian companies may use to help them succeed in terms of getting access to resources, geographic expansion, and having better access to patients by gaining access to the certified treatment centers that can administer these therapies. When we look at the therapy areas that are the focus of the cell and gene therapy pipeline, oncology is at the top. And this is very much in line with the leading therapy areas for just the Australian clinical trial data set that Dan has gone through. There is a lot of focus on hematological cancers by cell therapies, and much of that activity is with CAR T, and is the reason why you see so many hematological cancers listed as top indications for development in the table on the top right of the slide, such as myeloma, acute myeloid leukemia, and acute lymphocytic leukemia. Solid tumors are also being targeted, but there are questions about whether or not modalities such as CAR T therapy can work in solid tumors, and challenges in finding the right targets in a solid tumor. However, there are other regenerative medicine modalities that are being investigated, such as tumor-infiltrating lymphocytes, that may be more effective. Rare disease is also a big focus of the cell and gene therapy pipeline, and the table on the bottom right of the slide shows the leading indications by the volume of cell and gene therapies in development, with amyotrophic lateral sclerosis and retinitis pigmentosa as the leading indications currently. Not just in Australia, but globally, developers of regenerative medicines will face unique challenges to working and being successful in this market. And we've grouped those challenges into three main categories of development, manufacturing, and pricing. And we'll talk through each of these in a little more detail, starting first with development. Cell and gene therapy developers are dealing with much shorter timelines, and this is thanks largely to the use of expedited development pathways such as Breakthrough Therapy designation and RMAT designation in the US, the PRIME scheme in the EU, and the Sakigake designation in Japan, that is resulting in developers coming out of phase 2 trials and going straight into commercial production. Another challenge is because a lot of the focus of the cell and gene therapy pipeline is on rare diseases, there are much smaller patient populations, and actually finding the patients can be very difficult for developers. Another challenge is the fact that many of the pivotal clinical trials that are conducted on cell and gene therapies are one-arm trials or single-arm trials, and this may come under scrutiny by health technology assessment or HTA bodies, which would prefer to see a comparator arm. Another possible issue is the use of novel or unvalidated endpoints in clinical trials. And this came to light when Spark Therapeutics was undergoing the FDA Advisory Committee review of Luxturna, its directly administered gene therapy for a rare form of blindness. The FDA had specifically asked the Advisory Committee to weigh in on Spark's use of a new endpoint called multi-luminance mobility testing, which involves a patient navigating through a series of mazes under different levels of lighting. And while Spark Therapeutics ultimately prevailed and did gain FDA approval for Luxturna, you could foresee circumstances in the future where other cell and gene therapy developers are using new kinds of endpoints or novel endpoints that may get questioned. Moving on to manufacturing, one of the key issues is capacity constraints concerning manufacturing of vectors, which are the delivery vehicles for most gene therapies. And capacity constraints can come in a number of different forms. Firstly, in terms of the liters of culture needed to produce a sufficient volume of vector, and capacity in terms of the sheer amount of outsourcing partners, such as CMOs or CDMOs, that are available and have the unique capabilities to handle the demand from customers for manufacturing. And also capacity on the downstream purification process side, where viral vectors need to be separated from contaminants, which is a process that can yield losses of a significant proportion. On the cell therapy manufacturing side, there are also several challenges, such as the fact that you are dealing with cell availability issues. You're also dealing with a shorter shelf life for cell therapies and the important requirement of having a quality starting material that meets specifications. Autologous cell therapy, such as CAR-T, itself has many unique challenges logistically in terms of the unit operations that need to take place to ultimately produce that genetically modified medicine, and ensuring that those steps are aligned so that there is no delay in final patient infusion. The delivery of autologous cell therapy must be done at specialized and certified treatment centers. For instance, in late 2018, Novartis's Kymriah was approved in Australia, and that treatment is available at least 3 treatment centers in the country, including the Royal Prince Alfred Hospital, the Peter MacCallum Cancer Centre, and the Royal Melbourne Children's Hospital. Manufacturing therapies to scale is also a big challenge because developers are needing to think about scaling a lot earlier in the process because development in this sector is so expedited. There are also workforce considerations to keep in mind. Having the appropriately trained personnel to manufacture these therapies, and having the right equipment, whether it's bioreactors if you're scaling up a process or multiple processes running simultaneously if you're scaling out a process. Finally, moving on to pricing. With the recent wave of cell and gene therapies that have come to market in the last 2 to 3 years, what all of these have in common is high cost. Another big issue is the fact that many of these therapies are designed to have a very long durability, whether it's for 1 year, 3 years, or 5 years, or even the lifetime of a patient, but that durability is unproven at the time of launch. Another major issue is the fact that the value definition or the value proposition for cell and gene therapies, which is often used to justify that high cost, means different things to different stakeholders. So on one hand, you may have a payer who says that the value that I see in a cell and gene therapy is in its efficacy. How well does this product work? And also, what are the medical direct cost offset to the standard of care in that disease? On the other side of the argument, you may have a patient or a physician who says that while certainly efficacy is important, there are also other elements to consider, such as the ability for a patient to return back to work or to go back to school, or reducing the burden of a family member to take care of that patient. So quality of life elements that should also be factored into the value proposition and ultimately factored into the cost. Because the cell therapy modality is so new in Australia, it doesn't fit into the existing categories such as drugs and isn't eligible for funding via the Pharmaceutical Benefits Scheme. Greg Hunt, who is the federal health minister, has proposed that CAR T therapies such as Kymriah be funded in accordance with the mechanisms provided in the National Health Reform Agreement. So this is an area to keep an eye on. Because price is really the biggest challenge in the cell and gene therapy market, many cell and gene therapy developers have proposed alternative payment models to help ease that burden. And what we've seen in the recent wave of gene therapies that are being commercialized is a hybrid payment mechanism that combines outcomes-based pricing, so tying the price of a cell and gene therapy to how well it works against certain measurements, and an annuity model, so spreading those payments over a defined period of time. Spark Therapeutics, Novartis, and Bluebird Bio have each proposed or implemented these hybrid payment models. And what each of these has in common is that they are about 4 to 5 years in length. Michael Sherman, who is the Chief Medical Officer at Harvard Pilgrim, which is a U.S.-based payer, commented on this and said it's essentially really difficult to decide over what period of time we should be paying for a cell and gene therapy. But this sort of arbitrary 4 to 5 year time period that has been proposed by many companies seems to be an acceptable and a reasonable amount of time. So what we may see as more cell and gene therapies come to the market are payment plans like these. So to summarize in terms of cell and gene therapy, there is an opportunity for Australian companies to break into this market, which is growing in terms of the pipeline and addressing high unmet need. And while key challenges exist in development, in manufacturing, and cost, for Australian companies, there is a chance to grow. And based off the recent Mesoblast example, one way to do that is by teaming up with multinationals in the West. I'm now going to turn it over to Dan, who is going to walk us through global trends in oncology.
Great, thank you, Amanda. So absolutely, the other recurring theme within the presentation so far is the dominance of oncology. Australia is riding, you could say, the biopharma's biggest wave currently, and is certainly at the forefront of continued expansion with oncology. So to recap some of our data, 25% of partnerships and 35% of all industry-sponsored trials have concerned oncology drugs and/or patients. This is against the backdrop of oncology continuing to achieve clinical successes and remarkable commercial growth. The chart here shows oncology sales for the leading biopharma companies globally through the last decade. These reached $125 billion last year, having grown 50% in 5 years and doubling since the start of the decade. So central to some of oncology's recent successes is the emergence of immuno-oncology. This has created new standard of care drugs across a wide range of treatment settings, including checkpoint inhibitors for various solid tumors and cell therapies for some of the sickest patients with blood cancers. IO itself was worth $17 billion last year, and we conservatively project it to grow to over $40 billion. So IO is driving much of the wider growth in oncology as other drug classes begin to plateau. So the current IO pipeline contains over 2,000 different therapies. The first approvals at the start of this decade have triggered a huge proliferation in R&D interest. So as shown here, the pipeline's grown over 6 times since 2014, when these projects really first began to enter mainstream R&D. While the first approval, which was Provenge back in 2010, has failed to become a commercial success, it has paved the way for other classes, most notably the CTLA-4 and PD-1 checkpoint inhibitors. And now industry is exploring the myriad of ways in which the immune system can keep abnormal cell growth in check. There's huge diversity in the mechanisms being evaluated. So within pharma projects, we note 340 discrete targets. PD-1 does remain the cornerstone, and next-generation agents are very often aiming to boost the efficacy of checkpoint inhibitors. Bristol-Myers Squibb has the largest IO pipeline, boosted by its huge acquisition of Celgene, while traditional oncology players such as Roche and Amgen are also heavily investing in IO with the breadth of their portfolios. So with this increased pipeline size, the number of clinical trials has also similarly multiplied. So the increase in IO trials is certainly one of the underlying trends that's causing the increase in clinical trials globally, especially since 2014 or 15, when IO really began to enter mainstream clinical practice. So specifically within IO trials, the number has increased tenfold through the last decade. There are a record 877 trials initiated by industry last year. This is equivalent to more than 2 every single day. So as I just suggested, many of these new pipeline programs are being designed with PD-1 inhibitors as the standard of care already, and they need to be evaluated in combination with these. So the proportion of these IO trials that involve IO combinations has been increasing, and now over half of all trials, have such combinations. The increase in trial activity for IO is seen across all phases of development. Early stage successes have led into larger phase 3 trials to support product approvals and drive real-world use. But the fact that there's still a large proportion of recently initiated trials that are at the early stage of development really points to the fact that IO is still immature. As these trials produce data, we can expect the current treatment paradigms to continue to change very rapidly. This all paints a very, very positive picture of growth for the biopharma industry, but I want to exercise a bit of caution and suggest that continued commercial success in oncology is not guaranteed. Despite the huge increase in pipelines and clinical trials, healthcare budgets can only sustain so much spending. I've included some excerpts from discussions that Data Monitor Healthcare has had with oncology payers on the topic of checkpoint inhibitors. This suggests that there's certainly a ceiling to how far oncology can grow. As spending in oncology increases, other areas of medicine must feel the strain, so cost containment exercises will need to gain greater prominence. Industry can certainly have some accountability here, but especially as combination treatments become more widespread, new payment models such as indication-specific pricing or value-based reimbursements will be required. This is all going to come together to create a really tough and highly competitive market, and this market will be increasingly hard for small companies to penetrate and achieve success individually, such as domestic Australian biotechs. The dominant players such as Merck, Bristol Myers Squibb and Roche, these companies will benefit from their huge scale and reinforce their positions. While much of the scientific innovation can still be carried out by small groups, including domestic companies, these are unlikely to create considerable value unless Big Pharma is intimately involved. This is contrary to newer emerging areas such as cell and gene therapies, which are more ripe for innovation and disruption by small players. This brings us to the end of today's session, so I'd just like to wrap up with our conclusions and take a Q&A session. So in short, Australia remains an attractive proposition, but it is threatened by industry challenges. So it's attractive on account of its sizable patient pool and access to medicines, coupled with government investment and its workforce. Clinical trial activity is also a particular hotspot for Australian biopharma. Like many smaller countries, the domestic Australian market is heavily influenced and indeed driven by global trends. Oncology carries a disproportionate amount of attention, while Australian companies, you could say, are struggling to make a notable global footprint, competing against the huge scale of multinationals. The relatively modest fundraising scene in Australia may threaten its future global standing, as companies in other countries appear to have greater access to capital and partnerships. The current emphasis within oncology does place Australia right on trend, although this does not guarantee future growth as payer pressure increases. Although Australia is currently underweight in cell and gene therapy, there's certainly opportunities for domestic players to be highly disruptive and make a larger impact on the global scale. Mesoblast is one such a domestic example that's of a successful company that's been able to remain independent. Thank you so much for your time and attention today. As I said right at the start, we're going to make these slides and the recording available to everyone that's signed up, and we'll distribute those to you. But for the moment, we'll take a look at any questions that have been submitted. Please do continue to enter these into the box. If we don't have time for them now, we'll follow up with you via email. Thank you again. Amanda, did you have any questions you wanted to field?
Yes, Dan, we have a couple of questions. So I think we have time just for one before the end of the hour. So the question is, how much are academic or research institutions involved in partnerships in Australia? This is something that we did look at, but didn't have enough time to cover in this webinar. So while the majority of overall partnerships in Australia are traditionally structured with both partners either being a biotech company or a pharma company, or a biotech or biopharma company that's teamed up with a big pharma company, for example, about 1/3 of the partnership volume in the data set that we looked at involved a nonprofit organization, such as an academic center or a research center. And those deals came in a number of different forms. So for example, it could have been an Australian biopharma company that teamed up with an Australian-based nonprofit, or an Australian biopharma company that partnered with a nonprofit outside of Australia, or it could have been an Australian-based nonprofit that teamed up with a biopharma company outside of Australia. So one form of that type of partnership. And among the Australian-based nonprofit organizations, the biggest source of intellectual property and other types of licensing agreements by the volume of deals signed within the data set that we had were the University of Queensland, Monash University, and the University of Sydney. So academia did play a big part in over this particular 5-year time period.
Okay, thanks a lot, Amanda. I'm conscious now we've filled the full hour, so we will follow up. I know we've had some other questions come through. We'll have to follow up with you via email, but thank you, and please do continue to ask any questions that you do have. Yeah, thanks again for your attention. I really appreciate having you as attendees for this webinar, and hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Goodbye.